Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the L. Ron Hubbard Theater in Hollywood, California. Tonight we present a live broadcast of the Golden Age Radio Hour featuring L. Ron Hubbard's detective story, Brass Keys to Murder. Lieutenant Stephen Craig leaned against the rail of the USS Burnham and watched the shore boat come out toward him through the fog. He was a destroyer man, bearing the stamp of lurching, giddy decks, smashing waves, and full speed ahead. The shore boat rapped against the landing stage, bobbing in the gentle, greasy swell. Steve Craig's brows lifted in surprise. A girl had bridged the gap, and her high-heeled slippers were pounding up the ladder toward the deck. She glanced up. Her blue eyes were troubled.
Sally, what's the idea of coming out here this time of night?
I know you got Lee. You're on duty, Steve, and that I shouldn't be here, but this is serious. You've got to get away from here. I brought some money, and you can run before they come.
Run before who comes? Quiet down now, and just tell me very calmly what it is you're talking about.
Steve, your father died tonight. He was murdered.
Murdered? What, my father? What? Well, I've got to get ashore right away. I can get someone to relieve me. I'll call for a boat and we'll...
No, Steve. They're coming up. They're coming up here. The police, I mean, and they're going to arrest you for the murder.
Me? But why should I want to kill Dad?
They know that you and your father didn't get along, Steve, and that you were upset and...
But Sally, we patched that all up weeks ago, just before he sailed for Panama on his last trip. He was coming here tonight to see me. He just got in this afternoon. I've had the watch since noon.
But who's been with you since 5 o'clock?
Nobody much. Most of the crew is on liberty. The quartermaster isn't feeling so good, and I let him go down to sick bay an hour or so ago.
Can't you get someone to say... Look, Steve, here comes the police launch. You haven't time to do anything. They're going to make you get in that
harbor
launch.
patrol boat crowded with men shoved out of the black mist and banged hard against the landing stage, making the platform creak. Men began to get out. There were 4 in all: Haggerty, Detective Sergeant Green, and 2 officers. Green stepped down to the curving steel deck and looked around, mouthing a cigar.
Oh, Craig. I'm afraid you'll have to come along with us. There's a little matter. Oh, beg your pardon, Miss Randolph. I see you got here with the news before we did. Know all about it, do you, Craig? How we found the body, I mean?
I only know that my father is dead.
Of course, I expected you to claim ignorance of the works. They always do. You better come along with us right now. We'll put you in out of this fog where you won't catch cold.
You can belay the wisecracks, Green. Let's hear some more about this affair.
All right, but you're just wasting time, that's all. We found Jeremiah Craig's body about an hour and a half ago, floating near the docks. He got it with a knife in his side. German clasp knife. We pulled him out and I got busy. And I know all about the fuss you kicked up by running away to the Naval Academy instead of going to a merchant marine school. And you knew all the time how much old Craig hated the Navy.
You can skip that. How do you figure I killed him? I've been officer of the deck since noon because we're short of officers. And you know that I haven't left this ship. Look at the log over there if you don't believe me.
Green stepped over to the tilted desk and glanced at the huge book which lay open upon it. Coming back to Craig, he worked his cigar over into the corner of his mouth.
That hasn't anything to do with it. When old Craig docked this afternoon, he heard you were in port, and he decided it was about time he came over and gave you a lacing. And so when you were alone on the deck, he came up the gangplank swearing at you, and you grabbed out your knife and shoved it into his ribs. It was foggy, it was dark, nobody saw it at all.
Go on.
I figure it that way because the body was found south from this boat. The tide was ebbing in that direction 3 or 4 hours ago.
Oh, Green, You ought to have been a sailor. As a cop, you're a dud.
Look here now, young fella.
While I'm standing on this desk, you'll address me as lieutenant.
Don't fight, please.
My father, Jeremiah Craig, and I made up that old quarrel weeks ago. And he wanted to see me this trip to have dinner with me. Saw him on his last cruise.
Were there any witnesses to that?
No. We met on the dock late one night.
Why didn't you knife him that time? Wasn't your alibi good enough?
Keep a civil tongue in your head, Green. You may think you can come aboard this ship with 2 armed policemen and a fathead detective and tell me where to head in, but you're half seas over, get me?
He patted his duty belt and the holstered .45.
Making a show, aren't you? I talked with your brother Jim tonight before I came up here. He's on an insular shipping boat, and he didn't know anything about this patched up business.
Jim's been around the Horn. I haven't seen him for 6 months.
And I talked with old Andres up on Ship Street, and he didn't know anything about it.
I haven't seen Andres this cruise.
Well, maybe not, but he's seen you ashore. Tells me he's been trying to get in touch with you. Old friend of your father's, isn't he?
Yes. Mate with him on the Marianne in the China Sea in 1912. Why bring him into it?
And I saw Hawkins. Brant Hawkins. He's after your hide. After all, your dad used to captain for Hawkins.
Maybe he did. But Hawkins and Dad have been on the outs for the last year and a half. Why do you think Dad went over to the Insular Line and left Hawkins' ships?
I'm not worrying about that. You better come along, young fella. We'll give you a fair enough trial.
Yeah, I suppose you would. And then hang me at the end of it.
No. We'll hang you at the end of a rope,
said Haggerty.
Come along, I've had enough of this.
I'm not going anywhere. And I'll thank you to get off this ship immediately.
Take the gun away from him, boys.
You mean you're demanding my sidearms?
Sure, why not?
Because I cannot surrender my sidearms to anyone but a superior officer. Green, I'll remind you that you're standing on the deck of a warship of the United States Navy.
And what does that make me?
I do not happen to be liable to civil arrest so long as I stand on this deck. If you want to take me, you'll have to see the Judge Advocate General down in Washington. And he'll have to investigate this matter before anything can be done about it.
Yeah?
Yeah. And I'll give you 3 to get into that canoe of yours and beat it.
Green made a motion to the police. The 2 bluecoats stepped forward, hands wrapped tight about their nightsticks. Steve did not even seem to move, but the first officer rocketed through the air and slammed into a steel bulkhead. The second crashed through the rail, and the dull splash of his body came up to them through the fog. Haggerty backed up, spun about, and ran down the ladder. Green glared at Steve.
This boat sails in 3 days. It would take your Judge Advocate General that long to make up his mind about this case. We'll have you off here in 48 hours. And we'll have your shiny little stripes. And after that, we'll have the pleasure of hanging you for murder.
Green walked down the ladder to the waiting boat.
And don't you try to get ashore either. Navy or no Navy. If you set foot on land, we can arrest you in 2 seconds and make it stick.
Can they?
Steve watched the launch speed away and then turned his attention to the bruised set of knuckles.
Yeah, sure they can. But that isn't going to stop me from settling this case on my own.
When the staccato clangs of 8 bells had died away, denoting the hour of midnight, Ensign Billy Reynolds came on deck to relieve Steve. Steve walked aft, leaning over the fantail edge. Steve spotted the rowboat, which bobbed in the gray shadows below.
Sally!
All set, Steve. Slide down.
He laid hold of a line and lowered himself into the boat. The boatman looked at him stolidly and then shoved off. The boatman guided the craft in toward an age-slimed landing stage at the foot of Ship Street. Oh, wait. Nothing to do now. Sally and Steve went up the stage to the dock. Steve examined the dim street before them, watching for any sign of a policeman. They made their way between the silent, dark buildings until they found the number 10 on the front of a house. Steve went up the steps and knocked. Presently, the sound of heavy bolts creaked through the dampness, and Andries bowed them in. Andries was still shy of 60, but he looked much older. He walked before them, limping, favoring his artificial leg. He had lost the real limb, it was said, in the China Sea, and the occurrence had been the turning point of his life. But no one would deny that Andries, Joel Andries, knew his ships, nor that he knew all the doings along the waterfront.
In the next room, I got your brother and Hawkins and a young German by the name of Klaus. They're all I could find that knew your dad real well. And they're the only ones that had much to do with him in this port.
Thanks, Andries.
No, don't thank me, young bucko. I'm owing a right lot more than that to your dad. And I'm just as set as you are on bringing the murderer to justice. It's a privilege to be of help, especially with such a pretty lady as Miss Randolph. Before we go in and talk to these people, maybe you got something you'd like to say to me, private-like?
Would like to ask you what your opinion is.
That's the worst of it. I haven't got the smallest kind of an idea about where to begin. Any man that was crook enough to kill your dad deserves to be brought up and hung. And if they don't do it, the police, I'll do it myself with my bare hands. I sailed too many years with your dad, Steve.
Let's go in.
On the far side of the room, Brant Hawkins struggled to his feet. He wore a precisely pressed coat, and he carried a carved cane, which he held with his hat and gloves in his left hand.
Hello, Craig. I hear you're in trouble.
Yeah, so do I.
Jim Craig, mate's cap on the back of his head, stood up with a hard grin and nodded to Sally.
Caught up with the black sheep at last.
He didn't look like Steve, as he bore the stamp of a loser, different school. Klaus, the German sailor, shifted uneasy feet and fumbled with a felt hat.
Well, let's get down to business. I want to know all that you folks know about Jeremiah Craig's affairs these last few years.
We don't know very much, I'm afraid. We've been talking here, waiting until you came, and we haven't reached any conclusion whatsoever.
Except that somebody had it in for Jeremiah Craig bad enough to kill him.
Well, yes. Since he left my employ...
Why did he leave your employ?
Well, you see, he and I had an argument over a cargo. Jeremiah declared that he wouldn't go down to Peru after a cargo of... He wouldn't go down after this cargo before he said it was beneath his dignity to carry such stuff. And I told him, I told him that I could find plenty of captains who would. And he quit.
Uh-huh. And since that time, you've sold out to Insular Shipping.
You bet he has. Since Jeremiah was with him, the Insular people got plenty of cargoes they never even dreamed about getting. And I heard that you and Craig had an argument last year over that same thing, Hawkins.
What if I did? Craig always was a hot-headed old son.
What was that again?
I beg your pardon.
Steve turned to Klaus.
And where do you come in?
I don't know. That old guy over there, he picked me up in a flophouse and made me come up here.
Old guy, is it, huh? I ought to take you apart. And I would, too, if it wasn't for my game leg. You were fired off Jeremiah's ship last cruise. He kicked you down the gangway and told you never to come back.
And I know it. The old man told me all about it. It was a pretty mess to hear him sputter. You were trying to bring a cargo of your own through, weren't you, Klaus?
I don't know anything about it.
Maybe if I beat a little sense.
Wait a minute, Jim. We've had enough bloodshed to last quite a while.
You ain't going to make me talk any.
All right, we'll deal with you later. Now listen, Andries. I remember hearing of some doings on the last cruise of the Mary Ann. You were aboard her, weren't you?
Sure. I was mate of her, wasn't I?
And I was the midshipman.
You were a damned ordinary seaman. And we carried you on the books like that, though you never drew pay. And you were 8 years old.
Maybe. But I was there, wasn't I? And when those pirates climbed aboard us in the Yellow Sea...
The China Sea. You don't know anything about it.
I know a lot more than you think.
Oh, all right. What happened on that cruise?
Well, it was like this. Some of the boys got a little persnickety and tried to mob the rest of us. Bad food, poor pay, long time between ports. You know the story.
Do you suppose any of those men are alive today?
I doubt it. That was in 1912. And a man don't carry a grudge that long. I've even forgotten what those boys' names were.
I haven't. There was...
Let it pass. Andres is right. It's too long ago. But we haven't gotten anywhere at all. These aren't any reasons to kill a man. An argument over a cargo, a fired sailor, a mutinous crew.
But any of those reasons might go a lot deeper than you think, Steve.
If you don't mind, it's rather late. Think I'd better be getting home.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I'm gonna go to work on those things tonight. Where was Dad's boat wharf?
Oh, down at Dock 18. They found his body floating near there, too. You aren't going down there, are you, Steve?
Sure. I want to look through his papers before these dumb police get wise to the fact that papers might exist. And I'll have to work fast. You'd better scout around some too, Jim. And do some remembering. I'll get in touch with you.
Hawkins sidled toward the door and bowed his way out. Klaus followed him without any bow. Jim went down to the passage, humming thoughtfully. Andres shook Steve's hand.
Any help I can give, Steve, just let me know.
Thanks, Andres. I'll give you a tip.
What's that?
The murderer of Jeremiah Craig was in this room tonight.
Pier 18's warehouse was nothing more than a collection of fog-grayed shadows steeped in dismal silence. The SS Mandarin, Jeremiah Craig's freighter, queen of the insular line, was motionless and dark beside the wharf. Sally Randolph and Steve approached the dock with slow, cautious steps.
Better scout around. There might be a watchman.
And there might be police. Do you want me to wait out here?
No. Go back and find the boatman and have him bring the skiff under the Mandarin's stern.
Sally nodded and walked away, glancing back apprehensively at the ominously quiet ship. Steve watched her, sorrow in his eyes. Sally Randolph should be home sleeping peacefully. Steve moved from shadow to shadow down the outside of the warehouse toward the gangway. He hoped the watch would be elsewhere or not anywhere at all. Steve went up the gangway, his feet soundless. Almost to the top, the glare of the gangway light struck him full in the face. Beyond the light, he saw something glitter and ducked his head and hurriedly moved out of the light.
What's your business, mister?
Steve made out the glint of a police badge and the shimmer of brass buttons. Steve could not see the face, but he decided to bluff it out.
Chief Officer Hardesty, reporting aboard.
There was an annoyed growl in his voice. The officer stepped forward and looked under Steve's cap brim.
What business?
What business have you got aboard an insular boat?
The captain of this ship was killed. We're watching it, that's all.
Steve grunted and walked by as though going to his quarters. The policeman watched him from the top of the gangway. Steve turned into a passageway, walked the length of it, turned and walked down another. Opening a door, he mounted the ladders to the bridge. All was silence there. A white sign with blue letters, Captain, was posted over a door. Then a hunch seized hold of him. A sound of hurrying steps came from the upper end of the pier. Steve swore to himself. The officers had suspicions after all. He was headed for a phone in reserves. Steve wished despairingly that he had known the real chief officer's name to give the cop. Moving quickly, he went back to the cabin and turned on the light. Along the wall, there were pictures of ships and more ships. These had been the commands of Jeremiah Craig. Above the desk, framed in leather, were two pictures. One was from the log of Annapolis. The other was clipped from a newspaper. And they were both of Steve. He stared blankly at them. Something like a cotton ball clogged his throat. How many thousands of sea leagues had Jeremiah Craig traveled alone in this cabin with those tattered, poorly reproduced pictures. Steve, with an effort, jerked himself out of his reverie. Steve's eye fell on a carved wood chest. Throwing back the lid, Steve saw tattered, sea-beaten logs, tied bundles of letters, brown envelopes crammed with age-browned receipts. Steve pulled a suitcase out of the locker and crammed it full. The thing was heavy, unwieldy, but he could do no better. He was about to shut off the lights when his glance fell on the wastebasket. Only one envelope was there. Steve pulled it out and thrust it into his pocket. Footsteps were coming up the gangway. Retreat was cut off in that direction. Steve looked down. Police caps bobbed beneath his eyes. He looked along the boat deck, spotted a ladder at the far end, and ran aft. He whistled softly, but there was no response. Voices, gruff, excited, whipped down from the bridge. A whining voice belonging probably to a steward, aroused from sleep, came clearly to Steve.
Nah, there ain't no chief officer named Hardesty in the whole insular outfit. What's the matter with you guys?
Never mind what's the matter with us. Steve Craig came aboard this ship a few minutes ago, get me? Steve Craig, the man who killed your captain. This dumb flatfoot was too scared to tackle him. Turn out the crew. We'll search this tub from stem to stern. He won't get away.
Steve swallowed hard. That second voice belonged to Green. If he were caught now, he wouldn't have a ghost of a chance. He looked about him and laid hands on a length of halyard line. Bending this around the handle of the suitcase, he secured it. Hand over hand, he eased the suitcase down toward the water. When it hung a foot above the greasy surface, he secured the other end. Before he could turn, a glare of light crashed about him.
There he is! Get him!
A shot lashed at him. The bullet yelled away into the fog. He knifed out through space in a swan dive. The greasy water came up. The surface parted with scarcely more than a ripple and let him down into the depths. He turned himself about, holding air in bursting lungs, and struck out for the wharf and the protection of the pilings. He came up. A piling was at his right. He clung to its slimy roundness, looking for the skiff, hoping that it would not be spotted from the deck of the freighter. The creak of an oarlock came to him from some place near. That you, Steve?
Over here. Beside this piling. Make it snappy, I'm almost drowned.
The boatman was passing the skiff from piling to piling along with his hands. Steve laid hold of the gunwale. The boatman snatched at his collar and yanked him into the bottom. Sally helped him up and hugged him.
I couldn't find the boatman right away, Steve, so I'm so sorry.
It's all right. I left a suitcase dangling on the inboard side of the Mandarin. Maybe we'll be able to get it in a few minutes. Hear all that yelling?
They spotted you. Oh, I was so afraid that they would. Was it worth it?
We'll find out tomorrow.
At Steve's direction, the stolid boatman guided the skiff in under the rail of the Mandarin, where it was almost wholly protected by the dock and the steep ship side. Voices were calling from the decks above, and men were running to and fro, pulling bales apart, clambering in and out of dark corners.
See, they don't know I went over the side. There's the suitcase.
He reached out with an oar and brought it to them. The boatman brought out a knife and cut the line. No sign of curiosity on his seemingly frozen face.
Shove off. We'll go underneath the dock and leave from the other side. The warehouse will mask our trip to the destroyer.
I hope so.
The skiff went steadily on. In a few minutes, they were out in the empty fog of the harbor. The lights of the destroyer mirrored.
I bet I ruined that letter I found in the wastebasket.
What letter?
Steve drew it out and read it.
Send the brass keys to me. Otherwise, I will kill first for vengeance, second for caution, and third for profit.
Sally and Steve stared blankly at each other. It was night again, night overcast with the gray shadows of fog. Steve Craig leaned over the fantail of the Burnham and stared at the skiff, making certain that it really was Sally Randolph and not the police laying a trap for him. He slid down a line and balanced himself on a thwart. The boatman looked at him stolidly for a fleeting moment. Steve felt something mysterious. And then Sally was pulling him down to the seat, and he forgot all about it. Sally's voice trembled with subdued excitement.
Did you find out anything, Steve?
Several things. And when the cock crows in the morning, orders will be handed to the skipper to set me ashore in the custody of the police. We received a radiogram to that effect this afternoon.
Tomorrow morning? Why, Steve, it's 7 o'clock now. You have less than 12 hours to get to the bottom of this murder.
12 hours, half of one day. And although Rome was not built in a day, it took only one night to burn it down.
What do you mean?
That I'm gonna burn it down, that's all. There isn't any use playing with this thing. The only thing we can do is get in there, force the killer's hand, and establish why he killed my father. It's full speed ahead and damn the torpedoes. I told you, Sally, that tomorrow would see us married. We'll be, well, married or buried. And I'm gonna go south with the Burnham or get killed trying.
That sounds grim, Steve.
Maybe so. But I mean it. Now listen, Sally. I got a few things to get off my chest before we hit the beach. A fellow by the name of Bleak Fanshawe has those keys, and he'll either turn them over to me or he'll wish he had. That's the first thing I'm going to do, and I'll do it upright.
How do you know, Steve? What do the keys belong to?
To about $500,000 in merchandise and fabric, as nearly as I can make out. I don't know whether or not this is the right track, but I'm barreling at it with my safety valves tied down. Sally, I found a lot of information in those logbooks today, including a letter from Brant Hawkins and a warehouse receipt signed by Brant Hawkins for one of his wharves. Sally, there's something fishy here. Damned fishy. I've got a motive of sorts that I might be able to clinch.
You mean it, Steve?
Yes, we have something to go on. Listen, I uncovered one logbook from the 1912 voyage of the Mary Ann. To be short and not so sweet about it, there was a mutiny aboard that ship out in the Yellow Sea. It doesn't say much about it in there. It came after an attack of pirates.
Pirates?
Yeah, Chinese pirates. These pirates were a pretty tough lot. They used to tackle anything they sighted. It seems they sighted the steamer Mary Ann off the coast and set after her in their big seagoing junks, heavily armed ships. They tackled the steamer, boarded her, killed several of their crew. The crew fought back as best they could. Midway through the fight, my father, Jeremiah Craig, picked up a rocket, ignited it, and ripped into the midst of the pirates. The effect on the pirates was terrific. They hadn't seen the source of the rockets, and they thought their gods were firing on them with lightning. So they tried to retreat. My father cut them down with a rifle. That was the finish of the pirates. Their junks were heavily loaded, and before he gave the order to scuttle them, Dad inspected their cargoes. It seems that these junks had not had time to unload since their last raids, and the holds were filled with giant chests full of silk and ornaments and necklaces. And so, Dad gave the orders to transfer the stuff over to the Mary Ann.
But I wouldn't think that that would make enemies, Steve.
Well, you don't know men, Sally. The situation became acute. The sailors wanted a bigger share than they thought they would get. And my father wouldn't divide until he had consulted Hawkins, the owner of the Mary Ann.
Then Brent Hawkins owned Captain Craig's ship?
Right. So the crew, dissatisfied, mutinied. Right about there in the log, the writing is all blurred. I couldn't get the full details, but it must have been a serious fight. Andries was the first mate of the Mary Ann, you know, and he was reported in the log to be doing better after a leg amputation.
So that's how he lost his leg.
That's the way. Now, I'm not sure about all this. I've got to have some outside evidence, and the only way I can get that is through Bleak Fanshawe.
Who is he?
Well, the owner of the flop house called the Binnacle. He seems to have kept some of Dad's accounts, judging from the records. If he hasn't got the keys, then I'll make him tell me who has them.
You're clever, Steve. When you wanted to board the Mandarin, I was so worried.
Well, I got the books anyway. Oh, yes. There's that letter from Hawkins, too. Hawkins wrote Dad that the goods were not to be shared equally between members of the crew. He said that the Mary Ann was not a privateersman. It looked as if Hawkins was worried about his share of the booty.
That looks bad for Hawkins, doesn't it?
Steve helped her out to the dock, paid the boatman, and they went on up the gangway and made their way toward the street. He was about to stride out into the thoroughfare when he stiffened and leaped back.
What's the matter?
There's a patrol car over there. 2 cops in it, and they're looking this way.
Oh, then they're watching the whole waterfront.
Yeah, probably.
Where bound?
I gotta get those keys. See here, Sally. I didn't have a chance to tell you about the last note before we reached the dock.
What note, Steve?
He pulled it from his breast pocket, a ragged, tattered thing, and handed it to her.
It says, you have to leave the brass keys on barge 30 between 10 and midnight tonight. Otherwise you'll be...
Killed, yeah. And right now, we're on our way to the Binnacle and Bleak Fanshawe to get those keys. After that, we'll get Andries. And after that, I hope, the murderer.
You mean you'll give up the keys?
That killer, Sally, is going to be one very surprised gentleman.
The Binnacle was marked by a sign hanging in the dimness of an alleyway and lit by a single blue bulb burning beneath a painted compass disc.
Listen, Sally, I may run into trouble in here. Have you got a gun?
Yes, a 25 automatic. Makes more noise than it does holes.
All right. Then get over there in the dark niche and sit tight. If you hear shouting or shooting inside, wait only a moment or two before you run for it. Is that clear?
Too clear, Steve.
He turned and walked to the door and strode in, his eyes raking the assembled sailors at their battle-scarred tables. Over against the wall, there was a sudden movement. A man darted to his feet, eyes wide, face stolid. It was Klaus, the German, making a dash for the door. Steve tried to stop him, but Klaus was too quick. The door slammed and he was gone. Steve turned again to face the room. Behind the cashier's wicket stood Bleak Fanshawe, a remarkably pale man in a remarkably dirty apron. Fanshawe glanced uneasily over his shoulder and then back at Steve.
Hello, Fanshawe.
Hello. I don't believe...
Yeah, you know me all right. I'm Steve Craig.
Oh, sure. How are you? Remember you when you was a little fella. How you making out, Steve?
Let's go in that back room. I want to ask you a few things.
Sure, Stevie, sure. Anything I can do for you? Your dad and me were great pals. Anything I can...
I read some of the letters you wrote him.
Oh. Well, come in a room here where we can talk without being disturbed.
Steve followed Bleak Fanshawe into the cubicle, which served the Binnacle's proprietor as an office.
Listen, Fanshawe, to hell with lies, okay? I know that you kept some of Dad's accounts and some of his belongings, but that wasn't from Dad's choice, as I see it.
Can I help it if Captain Jeremiah didn't like my terms?
He owed you money, didn't he?
Used to. He's gonna pay it up this trip. You know, while you're here, Stevie...
I'm not paying off debts, Fanshawe.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to worry about. I don't know how all this happened, and I don't care. What did he give you as security?
Security?
Certainly. He gave you a ring of brass keys, didn't he? A ring of keys belonging to some Chinese chests. I want those keys.
You got me all wrong, Stevie. Look, your dad borrowed some dollars off me when he was a boy, and then forgot to pay them back. When I started to press the matter in 1910, he said he'd pay me right away, but he never did. Then he needed some more, and I let him have it. He gave me that
ring of keys.
Yeah.
There's your safe. The keys must be in there. Get them out and make it fast.
Fanshawe was smiling again. He waddled to the safe, squatted before it, and pressed greasy, fat fingers to the crusty dial. The tumblers fell audibly. He swung open the door. Abruptly, he sprang up. A large black revolver was centered on Steve's chest.
Stay where you are. Don't move, or I'll shoot. Try and hold the man up, will you? You're a common thief. Boys! Oh, boys! Come back here. I got this guy. He was trying to stick me up.
Steve backed against the wall. The office door swung back, and several longshoremen and sailors crowded into the room, their eyes eager with the prospect of a fight. A sailor at the door pounded away.
I'll get the cops!
The front door slammed, and Steve pressed the wall, watching Fanshawe.
I'll have you out of here in a second.
Said Fanshawe, very brave behind his gun.
You know, you can't come in here robbing honest men and get away with it.
I wasn't robbing you. I want those keys, and I'll get them.
Oh, we'll get them. The cops will settle your hash, young fella. I hear they've been looking for you. You're right smart. I also hear there's something like a reward for the first man that sights you on land. How do you like that? Takes the wind out of your sails there, huh?
Those keys aren't any good for you. You don't even know where the chests are.
Don't I know? Oh, well, you have a big surprise coming right now, you young fella. When Craig first came back...
Go on. When my father, Jeremiah Craig, came back from the Orient, you made a demand on him for your money. How much was it?
$10,000.
Well, that isn't so much. Why didn't he pay?
The customs wasn't paid on that truck he brought in, and Hawkins...
And so he gave you the keys to keep you quiet until he could get a good assessment on the chest contents. Why weren't those chests assessed by the customs?
Fanshawe glared.
Because you tried to blackmail him. Because you wouldn't give the keys back to him to have an assessment made unless he contracted to give you 50% of his share. That's why.
How did you know?
Because I guessed it. That's all.
Oh, great.
And I'd only have to take one look at you to be able to tell what kind of a rat you are.
Hey!
And now you think that Dad's death will give you full ownership because you've got the keys. You're wrong. I'm still on my 2 feet.
Fanshawe's eyes dilated. He glanced down at the heavy black revolver and hefted it. Turning his eyes to the men about him, he hissed,
Get out. And you don't know anything, see?
They drifted away. Silence reigned in the outer room. Fanshawe spun the cylinder of the revolver, making certain that its chambers were filled. He hefted the gun and licked his lips.
So, you wouldn't stop at killing a man to get your way clear to those chests? Are they worth that much?
You're an outlaw. They'll never get me for killing you.
Steve advanced a step, and the gun swept back into position.
Stop!
The black revolver steadied. The sights were lined on Steve's forehead. Fanshawe's small black eyes were pinpoints behind it. Abruptly, the lights went out. Fanshawe shrieked and fell back against the chair. The siren's wail said that the police car was in the alley. In the sudden blackness, Steve dived for the safe. His hands rattled through a drawer. They came in contact with keys, dozens of keys. He crammed them all into his pocket. Something else, round and splashing, was beside his foot, a can of brass polish. Steve took that too. Simultaneously, the front door exploded. Loud, excited police voices were there. The flashlights stabbed in and shined the two on the office floor.
It's Craig!
Bellowed an officer.
Shoot!
What?
Steve grabbed Fanshawe's gun and tried to sight the flashlight, which was betraying him. 2 shots racketed in opposite directions. The narrow window crashed, and Steve was gone, running down the alley. Ears keyed to the sounds of pursuit. A shadow was before him. Sally! Without a word, she fell in beside him. Steve drew to a panting stop along the street of docks, well hidden in shadow.
Those lights.
I turned them off. I heard the racket and the fuse boxes outside the office. I thought maybe that I could...
The fog was ripped asunder by an agonized scream. Steve sprang forward across the slippery asphalt. The scream, fainter this time, sounded again. It was too dark to see distinctly the 2 men who struggled together before him. Something shattered against Steve's head. He twisted sideways. Abruptly, empty space lay beneath him. He tried to take his assailant with him, but his hand slipped, and he hit the water and was swallowed up. Something else was floating near. A mass of stringy hair. Steve laid hold of it and raised the face above the surface. He could not see the features nor the expression, but there was something in the limpness of the thing which told Steve that the man was dead. A lion splashed near at hand, and Sally's excited voice cried,
Steve, step on it. The police will be here any minute.
Steve grasped the line Sally had thrown and secured it under the arms of the body. Glancing toward the dock, Steve saw a set of rungs nailed against a piling. In a moment, he was standing beside Sally on the dock. Close by, a nightstick was being pounded against a sidewalk.
The police, Steve. Let's...
Give me a hand with this line, Sally. And take a half hitch on your nerve. There's a dead man floating down there.
Sally's hands found the rope. Steve pulled the corpse over the side and laid it out. Sally, her palm against her mouth, looked away. Steve's face went white. His hands stiffened and his eyes were wide with horror.
My God, Sally. It's Jim.
A thin trickle of water-diluted blood was running down Jim Craig's side from the knife wound under his left arm. Jim's hard grin was gone, and in its place was a mask of frozen surprise. Steve snapped to his feet, stared at the lights, and then looked at the side of the warehouse.
Quick, Sally. Get up that ladder. We'll try to make it to the top of the other side.
Sally darted for the rungs and went up. Steve looked down once more into his brother's dead face. Then he followed. A bellow came from the dock.
Hold it there! I'll shoot!
Steve went on up. Sally's white face was just above him.
It's Steve Craig!
A barrage of lead snapped spitefully at the warehouse side. Steve wavered for an instant, stopped. Something like a moan came from his throat. Steve struggled to his feet and raced to the ramp which led to the top of the sloping roof. Half sliding, half running, he went down the other side, Sally close on his heels. Another ladder was there, and they scrambled down and made for the street, crossed it, and dived into the shadows on the other side. Not until then did he stop. He slumped against a brick wall. The exertion of lifting his head seemed too great for him.
Steve, what's wrong?
I just got out of breath a little.
Did they hit you?
Just a nick. Scraped my side. I can't even feel it. Forget it. I'll be all right in a minute.
Steve, this is Ship Street. Had we better get to Andre's place? They might search for us here.
Yeah.
Steve squared his shoulders and took her arm. In a moment, they were knocking on the door to number 10. Joel Andrews blinked at them.
Well, what's the matter?
Steve and Sally stepped inside. Steve fumbled for a chair and sat down.
Andrews, my brother was murdered just now.
Murdered? Who did it?
I'm sure I don't know, but I'll have an idea very shortly. Andrews, I received a note saying that I was to be at barge 30 between 10 and midnight. That was to leave a ring of brass keys there.
Brass keys?
Yeah. Did you ever hear of my dad owning any that were valuable?
Well, what's a string of brass keys got to do with it?
I'm sure I don't know.
I'll go with you, Steve. And I'll take me a blackjack and some brass knuckles along. We'll nail this gent and get everything straight. Did you say you had those keys to leave as bait?
Yes. I've got them in my pocket.
All right. We'll leave the keys in plain sight on the barge deck. I know just where that barge is. There isn't much light there, but the keys are bound to shine a little, so you hide yourself on the barge, and I'll hide behind a bit on the dock. And when somebody comes along to pick up the keys, we'll both jump him. Yeah. If he gets away from you, I'll wrap him good and plenty.
All right,
that's a good plan. I'll hide.
No, sir, miss, you better stay right here and wait for us. There's apt to be a lot of bloodshed, and I don't want to have to worry about you.
Oh, come on.
He's right, Sally. You stay here and rest up. It's been a pretty tough evening for you.
Sally frowned and then reluctantly agreed.
Now, what about this murder of your brother? Got any ideas why he was killed?
No, none at all. All I know is that the police spotted me at the scene of the crime. Oh. They'll try to make out that I did this killing and the first two.
They spotted you. That's bad, Steve. They saw your face?
By the flashlights.
Oh, there's no way to get out of that. If you were there with a dead man and the police saw you and didn't see anyone else, then you're the bucko who will have to take the blame.
Let's get going, Andrews. It's after 10 now.
Andrews pulled a weather-beaten hat down over his head and opened the door.
You wait right here, Miss Sally. We'll be back, and we'll bring you the killer to boot.
Steve followed the limping old man out into the damp mist. They walked slowly, Andrews' peg leg rapped monotonously on the pavement as he hitched along.
That's barge 30 up ahead. It's an oil barge, and it's empty. Hasn't been used for quite a while either, so there's no watchman hanging around it. It's pretty dirty.
That's all right. I meant to tip Hawkins off that the keys would be there, but I didn't have time, and if he's the one, it won't be necessary. He seems, whoever he is, pretty anxious to get this set of keys.
Well, here we are. You just drop down on that deck. Can you see?
Not very well. It's pretty black.
Oh, I've seen blacker places than this. That coil of rope down there ought to be a good place to hide. You can just climb inside it, and then whatever way this feller comes from, you'll be hid, and you just drop those keys out in front of you where they'll be an easy reach. I'll hide myself up there.
Okay. Steve lowered himself to the barge. His wet shoes stuck in the thick tar on the deck. As he walked with his hands, he found the coil of rope, a neat pile hollow in the center, a perfect barricade. Satisfied that he had not been observed, Steve took out his handkerchief and held it over the deck before him. The sparkling mass of keys jangled as they struck the tarred surface. As he sank back, he had the uncanny feeling that he was being watched. Minutes passed. The fog crept in through Steve's wet clothes and chilled him. He heard the Burnham's bell sound 6 times, 11 o'clock. The sound made him lonesome. Steve wished the fellow would come if he was coming at all. Andrew's cautious voice came from the dock.
All right, Steve?
All right. Steve fell to pondering on why his father and then his brother had been killed. He had an annoying hunch that if he had all the facts right, he had them right there in the palm of his hand, but he couldn't put them together properly. He sat up, blinking. He'd heard a footstep. He was certain of it. Abruptly, something rustled at his back. Steve stared up. A moving blur was over his head. Light exploded in his brain. Suddenly, he let all holds go and sank back into the coil, his head lolling back. His cap rolled away, a small white blur in the darkness. A heavy foot stepped on the cap bill, cracking it. Steve struggled back through layer after layer of gauze, each one a little less black than the last. He put out his hand and felt about him, encountering the ropes. Gingerly, he felt at the top of his skull. He was sick and cold and stiff. But he made himself stand up. As soon as he made a sound, Andrew's voice floated down to him from the dock.
See anything yet, Steve?
You're a hell of a guard.
And he realized that it wasn't Andrew's fault.
Somebody sneaked up on me and slugged me.
They did.
Andrew scurried to the edge of the dock.
I never heard a thing. They must have dropped onto the back of the barge and sneaked up.
Steve shook the numbness out of his brain.
Where are the keys?
Andrew's grumbling came down. Steve was fumbling on the tarred deck.
Gone?
Gone,
said Steve disgustedly. He retrieved his cap and set it on his head. Then, feeling suddenly weak, he sat down on a coil of rope.
Now listen, Steve. I'm going to locate Hawkins and Kloss, and I'm going to find out where they were this last hour. They're not going to get away with slugging you and stealing those keys.
All right, you go ahead. I'll go back and get Sally.
You're not coming with me?
Steve shook his aching head.
No. We might as well divide up forces. You see Hawkins, if you can locate him. I'll go on the scout for something else, all right?
Sure.
He struggled up the dockside and hobbled away, his peg leg thumping in agitated tempo. When the wave of sickness was gone, Steve felt in his pocket for his cigarette lighter. Being a wise sailor, he kept his smokes in a watertight case and did not depend upon matches. Lighting the smoke, he sat regarding the glowing spark and thinking. Presently, he ignited the lighter again and got down on his hands and knees examining the barge deck. The imprint of the keys was still there in the tar. Steve crawled in a small circle. He stood up with an angry exclamation and headed down the dock, walking fast. He struck out as fast as he could for Ship Street, his brows puckered in a worried frown. Ship Street was in silence when he reached it. 2 lights were showing, and one of them came from the window of number 10. Steve, with half a block to go, stopped dead still. From behind him came the moaning wail of a siren and the racketing chuckle of a police exhaust whistle. He plunged into a dark entrance and hugged the wall. The police cars drew up with squealing brakes before number 10. Men with riot guns in their hands swarmed out. Detective Sergeant Green, cigar glowing in the fog, bellowed,
Break the door down! In and get him!
2 brawny officers dashed up the steps and threw their shoulders into the door. It creaked. The police swept in like an avalanche. Then Detective Sergeant Green came out, pulling Sally Randolph by the arm.
Go on now, Miss Randolph. He's hiding in there somewhere, and you'll save the boys a lot of trouble if you tell them where.
He isn't in there. Let me go.
From inside came the sounds of pounding feet. The police were thoroughly wrecking Andrews' house in their search. Haggerty came out, puffing.
He isn't in there, Green. We searched the place from top to bottom.
Then he's somewhere around here. Search the streets.
Steve pressed back against the wall. He was in a blind alley, and there was no escape. Haggerty, still puffing, said,
There's no use of that. He's blocks away by this time.
You can't hold me. I'll...
You'll what? You're under arrest. As an accomplice to the murder of Jim Craig. We got the goods on you.
You're lying.
Oh, yeah? Well, here's a warrant for your arrest. Take a peep at that. Everything's regular, see? Everything. And when we get your boyfriend, the elusive lieutenant, he'll have company in jail.
Steve bristled and hugged back against the wet bricks.
He's not around. We didn't get a thing.
The hell we didn't, Haggerty. We got his girl. And he'll turn himself in to get her out. That's all I want. That's every bit that I want. And she'll squeal when we get her under the lights, won't you, lady?
I'll do nothing. Nothing. You'll get nothing out of me, Detective Sergeant Green.
Haggerty, see that a couple of men are posted around here in case our pal comes back. And you can drive me and this girl back to headquarters.
The cars got underway, one by one, and in a few minutes, the street was deserted. From behind the door of number 10 came the glint of a drawn revolver. They were waiting up there. Steve slipped silently out of his hiding place and sprinted for the waterfront. He reached into his pocket and drew forth the warehouse receipt he had found in Captain Craig's effects. Water-soaked and limp, the paper was hard to read. Glancing up at the black painted number on the dock across the street, he turned and headed north, walking in the shadows, avoiding any contact with people. Ahead, in a pier office, a light was swinging back and forth as though it had just been lit. Beyond it, Steve saw a man leaning over a roll-top desk. He stepped to the office door, gripped the knob, and strode in. Brant Hawkins jumped away from the desk. The German sailor, Klaus, whirled about, his breathing loud in the otherwise silent room.
Where are they?
What?
The keys. Where are they?
I don't know anything about keys.
Shall I throw him out?
Try it.
Hawkins' hand was inching toward the desk drawer. With a sudden lunge, Steve went over the side of the roll-top desk and came up holding a .38 police revolver in his hand. Hawkins blinked, shifted uneasily in his chair. You better watch out!
I'll put it away.
Yeah? And then what would you do? Pardon me, but I'd like to use your phone.
Phone? Who are you going to call?
The police.
Sir, you don't want to.
Look, can't we talk this over, Lieutenant Craig? If you were to name your price.
Reaching for the phone, Steve lifted the receiver.
Give me police headquarters, Central.
No, wait, there isn't use in...
Hello, desk. Give me Sergeant Green's office, please.
What are you gonna do, Lieutenant?
I'm gonna call the police in on this.
Look, Lieutenant, look. There isn't any use in... Wait a minute. Hang up, will you, please?
Steve heard Green's hello at the other end.
Hello, Green. This is Lieutenant Craig speaking. Yes, Lieutenant Craig. Listen a moment, will you? Bring your gang down here to Pier 34. Pier 34. That's right. Yeah, well, you got cast iron nerve yourself. Don't be all day, and don't forget to bring Miss Randolph. That's that.
Said Steve, hanging up. From the expression on his face, neither Hawkins nor Claus could suspect the anxiety behind the mask. Steve knew that he had settled nothing so far. He took the water-soaked blue receipt out of his pocket and placed it on Hawkins' desk.
Where is this stuff?
Hawkins eyed the receipt, frowning.
In the sail loft, Lieutenant, all the way back. It belongs to Jeremiah Craig. It did, I mean.
Steve's back was partially turned to Claus, and Claus took advantage of the fact. He aimed a kick at Steve's gun and sent it spinning into the corner. Then he raced out of the office, and before Steve could move, Hawkins had pounded out in Claus's wake. Steve shook his numb wrist and picked up the .38. He could hear the two running outside the warehouse, and he darted after them. Hawkins' legs were disappearing up the ladder into the sail loft. Claus was already out of sight. Lights glowed on the first floor of the warehouse, but it was all darkness above. He groped for the steep ladder and began the ascent as silently as possible. Near at hand, Steve could hear the sputter and cough of a launch engine. He wondered if there was a police patrol boat. Moving as slowly as possible, he drew himself over the edge and lay flat on his face, listening. To his right, he could see a square of dim light. That meant that the loft had a large glassless window facing the bay. Something bumped Steve's foot. He leaped aside and felt quickly about him. A canvas pile had moved. Steve understood then what was happening. They were trying to shove this pile out the window. Steve heard a scurry of footsteps within the loft. A strangled voice swore. Feet pounded across the planking. Brakes screeched. The ladder to the sail loft creaked with the weight of many men. A prayer was on Steve's lips. If everything did not turn out all right, he would be jailward bound. If he could not satisfy Green of the murderer's identity, he would have to stand the charges himself.
Hey! Hey, in here!
Badges glittered everywhere. Steve's first glance around halted upon Sally Randolph. She stood at the top of the loft ladder, police close by. Steve tried to smile at her. Green's hard tones fell upon Steve's ears.
Well, we got you.
I called you here!
Turned yellow, huh?
Steve looked around and saw Hawkins and Claus. They stood close together, handcuffed. Steve's eyes fell on Andries. Andries nodded brightly.
We got him all right.
Steve looked up at Green.
Green, you're a fair man. I've always heard that about you.
Detective Sergeant Green was somewhat taken aback.
Well, there are those that say so.
All right, then. You found some brass keys on the prisoners, didn't you?
No, but we can look. Hey, Haggerty, search those two mugs, will you?
Yeah, don't let him touch the keys with his bare hands.
Sure, I get it. Fingerprints.
That's right.
Haggerty turned Hawkins and Claus around. From the left pocket of Hawkins' coat came a jingle. With his handkerchief, Haggerty reached into the pocket and brought forth a set of keys.
There. Now listen to me, Hawkins. What were you and Claus trying to smuggle on Dad's ship?
Hawkins turned pale and glanced hurriedly toward the back of the loft. Green, catching on, went to the rear, pulled up a tarpaulin, and uncovered a pile of cases.
Rum! What's this all about? Hasn't repeal done away with you smugglers yet?
Well, you see, the tax.
Oh, so you make the tax off it?
He saw that one of the cases was open, and with a quick glance about him, he grinned and took out a bottle.
Well, this doesn't happen to be my jurisdiction, but I'll fine you a quart.
All right. Now, you see that pile of chests over there?
Where? Oh, yeah, the Chinese chest. What about them?
I want you to open them up.
Okay.
Green reached for the brass keys Haggerty held in the handkerchief.
No, those won't fit it. They came out of Bleak Fanshaw's souvenirs. Here's the real bunch.
He pulled a ring from his breast pocket and jangled it. The keys were dull, unwieldy. Green took the keys and approached the chests. Inserting one after another into the first lock, the chest came open. An officer shined a flashlight into it. Green stepped back. His jaw slackened.
Why, the thing's filled with brocades.
He picked one up, handling it carefully. Then he reached in and found a small box. Opening it, he exposed the contents to the flashlight. With an appreciative exclamation, he drew out a string of pearls.
Oh. You mean all 6 of these chests are full of such stuff? Why was it left here?
Yeah, because even the king of safecrackers couldn't make a dent in those metal-bound chests. And unless they were opened and the contents moved, it would take a big crew of men to steal one. That's my father Jeremiah Craig's share of the loot of a Chinese junk he took out in the Yellow Sea.
China Sea.
Yellow Sea. Now listen, Green, did you pick up anybody loitering about the dock?
Sure. Say, Craig, you must know all the answers. Hey, bring that guy up here.
All right, Green. All this was done to get possession of the set of keys I just handed over to you.
Yeah?
Yeah. You can check all my statements by calling up Bleak Fanshawe and several others. Green, I received a note this afternoon. You've got it, haven't you, Sally?
He took it.
Yeah, that bunk about you leaving the keys on the barge. Well, what about it?
I left the keys there. Or at least, I left a set of keys out there. Bleak Fanshawe lent them to me. And I shined them up with liquid brass polish.
I get it. Liquid polish leaves a dry surface,
exactly.
And fingers leave fingerprints in the form of corrosion.
Right.
But come on, Craig. I'm doing you a hell of a big favor by listening to you at all. This stuff has started to look kind of screwy.
Well, you'll find the print on those keys.
Green reached into his overcoat and drew out an old envelope. Then he unscrewed the top of his fountain pen and approached Hawkins.
Here you go, Rummy.
He smeared ink on the index finger of Hawkins' hand and took the print off of it with the envelope. Then he did the same with the other fingers. Finally, he turned to Klaus and repeated the trick. Approaching a policeman with an electric lantern, Green took the keys he had found on Hawkins and compared the prints. He jerked his head at Steve.
They aren't the ones, are they?
No. But how did you know that?
Just did, that's all. Here, look at my hat. Look at the underside of the cover. See that?
Sure. It's got a round black spot.
That's right. That's a footprint. Left there by Joel Andrews. Huh? Joel Andrews is the murderer of Jeremiah Craig and my brother Jim.
Andrews jumped back, his peg leg rapping the planks. He scowled. Green, sudden comprehension on his face, headed for him. Fountain pen and envelope ready.
No.
Green grabbed the flailing arms and obtained the prints. Then he compared those on the key. He smiled at Steve.
They're the same.
Sure they are. Andrews was up here before Hawkins came. And Andrews didn't want those keys to be found on him, so he planted them on Hawkins. Simple enough. It was Andrews who tipped you off where to find me, wasn't it? He said to go to number 10 Ship Street. Well, that's his own place. He knew I was going back for Sally. He thought I'd run into you. You'd run into me, and that'd be that.
I'll get you yet, Steve Craig. I said I'd get all of you, and I will.
Maybe so, but I don't believe in ghosts. Get me?
Anyway, it sounds good.
Yes, it does. Andrews was with Dad out in China on the Marianne. When they were in the Yellow Sea, they were attacked by pirates, but they overcame the pirates and looted the junk of those chests. Andrews was not satisfied with the division that Captain Craig wanted to make and led a mutiny against my father. Eventually, the mutiny was put down and Andrews was punished by...
Keel-hauled! Do you hear me? Keel-hauled! They passed ropes over my wrists and under the hull and pulled me all the way through.
So, a shark or something of the sort nailed him when he was in the water. He pleaded he'd behave, and Dad didn't report the matter, thinking that Andrews had suffered enough. But all these years, Andrews has nursed a grudge against the Craigs. He killed my father, Jeremiah Craig, because he thought he had those brass keys in his personal possession. Then he threw the body in the water downstream from the destroyer. Finally, he waited till I came up the waterfront with Sally. Then, being certain that I was near to take the blame, he knifed my brother. But Andrews did not want to kill me. He cooked up this barge idea. He was to watch on the dock, and I was to watch on the barge. He slugged me from behind, took these keys, informed you where you could find me, and then lit out for this place. He was at work trying to open the chest with the wrong keys when I got here. Hawkins and Kloss had been running this minor smuggling racket. And hearing about this murder business, they were afraid that they would be exposed. Their crime was small enough, but it seemed big to them. I believe the fine is only a couple $100 in their case. I figured out most of this when I saw the round black spot in my cap. Further, I was puzzled as to why the man who had slugged me had not killed me outright. Could have been done easy enough. Andries hadn't killed me because he wanted to get the loot and let me take the rap for both murders.
Now, wait a minute. How did Andries know all your movements?
You brought that man up here yet? Oh, there he is.
The boatman stood woodenly at the top of the ladder.
This is the man Sally employed to row us. Who recommended him to you, Sally?
Why, Andries did.
There you are. The boatman was to get a launch and wait for him underneath the sail loft window of the pier. Andries was going to pass this loot down, a bale at a time. That's why he had to have the keys. And he couldn't move these chests alone, or even with 10 men.
Andries was still glaring. He tried to lunge forward, but the policeman held him securely.
I'll get you for this, Craig. I'll get you! After I worked and slaved for years to get this all figured. And after I'd waited for months to get all three of you Craigs in port at the same time.
Take him away. It's open and shut, Haggerty. And take those bracelets off this guy Hawkins and his pal. We'll forget about that rum. Can't be bothered with small stuff. And as for you, Craig, you can be damn glad I don't jump at conclusions, see?
Yeah, I'm glad you don't.
He went across the planking and took Sally's hand. Big tears stood in her eyes. Her lips were trembling. Steve stopped that.
We better get home, get some sleep. Both of us, after all, this is your wedding day.
You mean everything's all right?
Everything. And you see those chests over there? They're a wedding present that my dad brought you all the way from China.
Oh, Steve.